Chicago, November. The hotel bar was the kind of place where secrets went a-breathe. Low amber lighting, just so quiet it felt like something you remembered rather than something you heard. The kind of clientele who wore anonymity like a second skin. Old money, new power, people whose names appeared in newspapers only when their lawyers allowed it. Zara did not belong here. And yet, here she was perched on a velvet barstool in a borrowed red dress, nursing a glass of Merlot she hadn't ordered, waiting for her best friend Bria, who was already 40 minutes late, and not answering her phone. At 25, Zara was stunning in the way that women who don't try too hard often are: dark, flawless skin the color of well-steeped tea, natural hair pinned up loosely, cheekbones that her Ghanaian grandmother called the face God spent extra time on. She was a structural engineer at Caldwell and Ross, smart and careful and deeply, stubbornly practical. She did not do spontaneous. She did not do reckless. She was, however, on her third glass of wine alone at a bar in a hotel she couldn't afford, so perhaps tonight was an exception. "You look like you're solving a problem," said a voice beside her. She turned. The man who had slid into the seat next to her was not the kind of man you looked away from quickly. He was Korean, mid-40s, the kind of handsome that age had only refined rather than diminished, sharp jaw, dark eyes that held a stillness she found immediately unsettling, silver threading through black hair at the temples. He wore a charcoal suit with the ease of a man for whom clothing was simply armor he'd stopped thinking about. No tie, top button open. A watch on his left wrist that cost more than her annual salary. He was looking at her with the full, undivided attention of someone who had decided she was the most interesting thing in the room. "I'm not solving anything," she said, turning back to her wine. "I'm waiting. For my friend, who is late." "Ah," he signaled the bartender with 2 fingers, an economy of motion that produced immediate results, the way authority always did. "Then you are killing time." Apparently. He introduced himself simply as Jin. No last name, no title, the kind of introduction that told her either he was very humble or very powerful. In her experience, powerful men were the ones who never needed to explain who they were. His English was precise and clear, faintly accented, every word chosen with a deliberateness that she found herself leaning toward without meaning to. They talked about nothing important: the architecture of the hotel, the jazz, whether Chicago winters were punishment or character building. He was funny in a dry, understated way that caught her off guard. He listened when she spoke. He did not check his phone. When Bria finally texted, something came up. "Sorry, call you tomorrow." Zara looked at the message, looked at the man beside her, and made a decision that did not feel like a decision so much as a door that had already been open for some time. She stayed. They closed the bar down. Zara could not afterward fully reconstruct how it happened, not the mechanics of it, but the logic. The way the conversation had moved from surface to depth like water finding its level. The way he'd looked at her when she laughed, like she was doing something remarkable. The way 2 glasses of wine had become 3 and then the bar had been empty and the bartender had been politely wiping down surfaces, and Jin had said, "I don't want this evening to end yet," and she had thought, "Neither do I." She knew better. She was engaged, for heaven's sake. Marcus had proposed 4 months ago. Marcus Webb, 30 years old, charming and ambitious and crazy about her, a man she'd met at a charity gala and dated for a year before he'd gotten down on one knee in the restaurant where they'd had their first date. The ring was on her finger. The date was set spring, 10 months away. She loved him. She had not, however, removed the ring before she came out tonight. It was on her right hand now because the left had felt suddenly complicated. She told herself that was meaningless. She told herself a lot of things that night. Room 4214. She remembered the number afterward, with the clarity that guilt reserves for the details it wants you to keep. Jinho was not a gentle man in the way that soft men were gentle. He was deliberate, careful in the way that powerful things are careful, knowing their own weight. When he looked at her in the low light of the hotel room, it was with an attention so complete that she felt, for the first time in years, entirely seen. Not as someone's fiancé, not as the girl from Accra who'd made it, not as anything other than exactly, precisely herself. She would tell herself it was the wine. She would tell herself it was loneliness, the particular loneliness of loving someone who was sometimes more ambition than person, who sent flowers when he forgot dinners, who was building an empire with such focus that she sometimes felt like a room in it rather than the reason for it. She would tell herself a great many things in the weeks that followed. But the truth, the quiet, terrible truth, was that she had wanted to. And she had. And Jin had held her afterward in a silence that was not awkward but complete, and pressed his lips to her temple and said nothing, and she had fallen asleep in a strange man's arms, feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe, chosen, wanted. She was gone before 6 a.m. She left while he was still sleeping, or pretending to sleep. She couldn't be sure, and she took a cab back to her apartment in Lincoln Park and stood in the shower for 30 minutes and made herself a promise. It was one night. A mistake born of wine and loneliness and a man who had appeared at the exact wrong moment. It would never happen again. She would never see him again. She was, she told herself, fundamentally a good person who had done a bad thing. Good people did bad things sometimes. The defining quality was whether you repeated them. She would not repeat it. She put the ring back on her left hand and called Marcus, and told him she missed him, and he said, "I miss you more, babe," and she smiled and meant it and buried everything else somewhere very deep. She did not see Jin for 3 weeks. And then Marcus said, "I want you to meet my father." They drove to the Gold Coast on a Sunday, Marcus's Porsche, Zara in a cream-wrapped dress, her hair down, the ring catching sunlight. Marcus was bright with anticipation in a way she'd rarely seen him. He talked more than usual. His hands were animated on the steering wheel. "He's going to love you," Marcus said, for the 3rd time. "You're nervous," she said. "I'm not nervous. My father's opinion matters to me more than most people's." He glanced at her. "He's not an easy man to impress, but you're not easy not to be impressed by." That sentence was complicated. "So is my father." He smiled, but it didn't quite settle. "Just be yourself, okay? You're perfect. He'll see that." The building they pulled up to was a landmark, a converted historic mansion on a store street, the kind of address that had been significant for 100 years and intended to remain so. Black iron gates, manicured grounds even in November, a security presence subtle enough that most people would mistake it for staff. Zara noticed. She always noticed details. It was the engineer in her. She noted the cameras at the gate, the earpieces on 2 of the men near the door, the deliberate positioning of a 3rd near the garden wall. Her stomach moved, in a way she attributed to nerves. Marcus took her hand and led her up the front steps, and the doors opened before he knocked. Inside, the house was extraordinary, dark wood, museum-quality Korean art, fresh flowers that must have cost a fortune, a quiet so deliberate it felt designed. Staff moved like water around obstacles, there and then not there. A man was standing at the far end of the entrance hall with his back to them, looking at a painting, broad shoulders, charcoal suit, silver at the temples. Zara's heels stopped moving. Marcus called out warmly, "Abioji." The man turned. The stillness that settled over Zara's body was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Not panic, not quite. Something more like the moment before impact, when your body knows before your mind does, when everything sharpens and slows simultaneously. Dark eyes, precise jaw, the watch, the particular quality of his attention. "Jin." He looked at her with those unreadable, still eyes, and nothing moved in his face, not surprise, not guilt, not recognition. Nothing. The absolute, terrifying control of a man who had spent decades making sure that nothing showed on his face that he did not choose to put there. And then he smiled, warm, patrician, the picture of a welcoming father. "Marcus," he said, "you must be Zara." He extended his hand to her. "I have heard so much about you." His fingers closed around hers. Her ring pressed between their palms. She smiled back because what else could she do? Because Marcus was watching with hopeful eyes. because the world had just rearranged itself into something she did not have a name for yet. "It's wonderful to meet you," she said. Her voice did not shake. She would be very proud of that later. The dinner table was a battlefield dressed as a dining room. Zara had sat through difficult meals before, Christmas with her mother's side of the family, where politics and old grievances lived in the space between courses. Client dinners where everyone was performing. First date silences that stretched like taffy. But nothing in her 25 years had prepared her for this. Sitting across a mahogany table from the man she had slept with 3 weeks ago, watching him pour wine for his son, her fiancé, with the steady hands of someone who had never once in his life lost control of a situation. Park Jin-ho was extraordinary in his stillness. That was the word she kept returning to. Still, like deep water, like the moment before a verdict. He engaged Marcus in conversation about the Seoul office, about expansion timelines, about a deal in Singapore that required delicate handling. And his voice was the same voice that had said, "I don't want this evening to end yet," in a hotel bar 3 weeks ago. Only now it was a father's voice, measured and authoritative, and Zara sat with her hands in her lap and her wine untouched, and her smile fixed in place like something load-bearing. Marcus was oblivious. That was the mercy and the torment of it. Her fiancé was bright-eyed and warm and kept touching her hand across the table, small, reassuring presses of his fingers against hers. "Look how well this is going. Look how right this is." And each time he did it, Zara felt the specific horror of a woman standing in a burning room that only she could see. "Zara is a structural engineer," Marcus was telling his father. "Caldwell and Ross, she just led the load analysis on the Meridian Tower project." Jin-ho turned his attention to her fully. "Impressive," he said, and then, with the faintest modulation that only she could hear, "You strike me as someone who understands how to find weakness in a structure." She held his gaze. "I understand how to make sure things don't collapse." A pause, something moved in his eyes, appreciation perhaps, or a warning. With this man, she was beginning to understand, the two might be the same thing. "Good," he said simply, and turned back to Marcus. After dinner, Marcus was pulled into his father's study for what Jin-ho called a brief business matter, and what Zara immediately recognized as intentional. She stood in the formal sitting room, all dark wood and celadon ceramics and fresh white orchids, and looked at the door that had closed behind them and understood that she was being left to sit with what she knew. She was being given time. She used it to think, which was what she did when the world became unmanageable. She was an engineer. She dealt in forces, loads and stresses and points of failure, how structures held and why they broke. She applied the same logic now. What are the facts? Fact, she had slept with a man named Jin at a hotel 3 weeks ago. Fact, Jin was Park Jin-ho, Marcus's father. Fact, Jin-ho had looked at her tonight and shown nothing. No guilt, no panic, not even the micro-expression of a man surprised by circumstance, which meant one of two things: either he was the most controlled human being she had ever encountered, or... The door to the hallway opened. She didn't turn around. She knew, from the quality of the silence that preceded him, who it was. "He'll be 20 minutes, Jin-ho said. "There are quarterly reports that need his signature." "You planned this," she said, still not turning. "I planned a dinner." A pause. "I did not plan you." She turned then, because she needed to see his face when he said things. He was standing near the doorway, jacket still on, hands loosely clasped, looking at her with that specific quality of attention that had undone her in a hotel bar and was no less devastating now, in his own home, in the context of everything she now knew. "You knew who I was," she said, not an accusation, a structural assessment. "I knew Marcus was engaged. I did not know to whom." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "If I had known." "Don't," she held up one hand. "Please don't tell me it wouldn't have happened. I don't want a comfortable lie right now." He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, "No, you're right, I won't." It was the most frightening thing he could have said, because a denial would have given her somewhere to stand. The truth, this particular truth, offered so cleanly, left her with nothing solid beneath her feet. "This ends tonight," she said. "Whatever that was, it was a mistake, and it ends, and it never happened." Jinho looked at her for a long moment. "Of course," he said. She didn't believe him. She didn't entirely believe herself. She said nothing to Marcus on the drive home. He talked because Marcus always talked after seeing his father, a release of energy, like a pressure valve, all the things he'd held carefully composed during the meal now spilling out easily. He talked about the Singapore deal and his father's vision and the expansion plans, and underneath all of it, like a frequency she was only now tuned to, she heard it. The particular devotion of a son who had spent his whole life trying to be worthy of a man who had never once made it easy. "He liked you," Marcus said, as they pulled into her building's underground garage. "You think?" "I can tell with him, he doesn't perform warmth, he doesn't have enough patience for it. When he's actually engaged, he goes still." Marcus smiled, parking the car. "He went still with you." Zara looked at the concrete wall in front of them and said nothing. She knew now what that stillness meant. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark of her apartment. Marcus had gone home to his place, early meeting, a kiss on her forehead that she'd barely felt, and she stared at the ceiling and conducted the kind of internal audit that she usually reserved for structural reports. Every angle, every load, every point at which things could fail. Options. Tell Marcus. Watch everything she had built, the relationship, the future, the ring on her hand, detonate in real time. Watch a son discover that his father was that kind of man. Watch herself become the woman who had destroyed her own engagement through one night of weakness. Tell no one. Carry it. Hope that Jinho's cool composure held, that he was as controlled as he appeared, that the secret had a shelf life measured in decades rather than weeks. Or, and this was the thought she kept circling back to, the one that frightened her most, find out who Jinho Park really was before she decided anything. Because something was wrong. She could feel it the way she felt structural instability, not with her eyes but with some deeper professional sense, the part of her trained to identify stress before fracture. The security at the house. The way staff moved around him. The phone calls Marcus stepped out for, all the times she'd attributed them to business. Now rearranged in memory into something else. She picked up her phone at 2 a.m. and typed Park Jinho Chicago into a search engine. The first page of results was clean, philanthropy, real estate, the Park Foundation's charitable endowments, a Forbes profile from 3 years ago that described him as a reclusive Korean-American billionaire with extensive holdings across East Asia and North America. She clicked to page 2. There was a single result from a now-defunct Chicago independent news site dated 7 years ago. The headline had been edited, she could see the placeholder text, but the cached version still existed in a digital archive. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she sat up in bed and held her phone with both hands and understood that the storm she'd sensed at the edges of Marcus's world was not a storm. It was a machine, old and vast and completely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Park Jinho was not merely a billionaire. The article, sourced from a former federal prosecutor who had since recanted under circumstances the article described as murky, alleged that the Park family fortune had been seeded in the 1990s through a network of Korean organized crime syndicates operating across Seoul, Los Angeles, and Chicago. That the legitimate empire, the real estate, the development funds, the charitable foundations was architecture. Beautiful, functional, load-bearing. Built on top of something that did not appear in any annual report. Zara put her phone face down on the mattress. She thought about Jinho's hands, how steady they were. How a man's hands told you everything about what they'd held, what they'd done, what they'd never once trembled over. She thought about the cameras at the gate. She thought about the way he'd looked at her across the dinner table, not with guilt, but with calculation. And she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who built things for a living, that she had not stumbled into an affair. She had stumbled into something with foundations she hadn't yet seen the bottom of. Her phone lit up. An unknown number, a text message, 4 words. We should speak, tomorrow. She didn't need to ask who it was. She stared at the message for a long time. Then, against every instinct she possessed, she typed back. Where? If you enjoyed this billionaire romance, please like and subscribe to the Billionaire Evolution channel for more luxury love stories. See you tomorrow.